Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to GLOBSEC's next session in the Marie-Thérèse Room, Tackling Climate Crisis, the Business Case. Please welcome your moderator, Kathleen Koch.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us. Well, as you heard, we are here to discuss the climate crisis, and it is indeed a crisis. If you've looked at the numbers, they're alarming. Carbon dioxide levels are the highest, they haven't been this high in our environment, in our atmosphere, in 800,000 years. Global sea levels have been rising 20 centimeters over the last century, and that rate accelerates every year. Ice sheets are melting. I know at least in the United States, we are seeing natural disasters become more frequent and severe. Basically, we've got to do something. And what we're going to be talking about today is, what about businesses? They are the primary cause around the world of global warming, of climate change. So what do we do to make sure they are doing their part? I've got a terrific panel here today to discuss that with us. So if my panelists will come in, first of all, Yuba Sokona, the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Next, Ulf Sverdrup, Director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Maithri Sitharaman, I'll get this right, Fortune Magazine's Live Media Director of Content, and then Themis Themistoklios, who is head of UBS's European Investment Office. So welcome, my terrific panel. And before I sit down, I do want to say we're going to you, members of the audience, first. I hope everyone is signed into Slido, because we're going to ask you to take a brief poll for us. Give us your opinion. First of all, question number one, what percentage of businesses do you believe is taking significant action to stop climate change? And of course, anyone watching on the live stream is also signed in, can chime in and give us their opinion. So let's give everyone a few minutes to register their answers, because that's a bit of a depressing result. If we believe only 20% of businesses in the entire world are taking significant action.
That's not bad.
Oh.
It's better than
Someone
zero.
Someone actually believes 100% are taking significant action. We have some optimists. All right, look at the numbers change. All right, I don't know when we know if they're all in. Okay, slight change. Oh, there we go. A few more optimists. Okay, well, let's move on. It looks like we're tied right now between 20 and 40%. Oh, okay, well, looky there. Now at 40%. Okay, we'll go to the next question. This is just for you as individuals. Do you believe that climate change will impact you and your life? So let's, okay. So far there's no doubt. Not a climate denier in the entire audience, nor watching our live stream. Guess they don't tune into discussions like this, eh? Okay. All right, we'll be moving on. Well, let me take a seat then. So, my panelists, why don't you tell me what you think? Was the audience right or wrong? What was our final figure? Was that 40 to 60% said they felt 40%. That businesses are taking significant action?
That makes me quite happy that that's the numbers.
Okay, like right about 40%.
40%, 36% of the audience believe that, and that does give you confidence that they do look at what companies are doing.
But are they right? I mean, has anyone actually quantified this?
I don't think we have data, and it's actually very, very difficult to define the data. I mean, we're talking about all companies, and you can imagine there's public companies, there's private companies across the world, so very difficult to quantify. And I think the other topic I think we'll come to later on is how do you define significant action? Because I think that's one of the big challenges we're facing in the industry, definition of data and how we measure the impact of what companies or governments do.
Now, Yuba, The IPCC put out a very important report in the fall, back in October, on the 1.5 degrees Celsius. What did you find when it comes to the business world? Are they doing enough when it comes to climate change?
I think that the IPCC, the science is clear, and the IPCC 1.5 report that has been released last October clearly indicated, because it's depend on the target. If you want to reach 1.5 degree by the end of this century, and then it require a profound transformation on the whole system of the society. It is not only incremental in a specific sector, the entire society, because climate is not changing in isolation with the other changes of the society, the institution, the cultural, the economic, the social, and then all those are affecting climate, and climate is affecting, we cannot isolate.
Did you have a particular message for the businesses of the world, and if so, what was it?
Because the whole model, the whole business model is no longer valid. And then
So you said throw out your old business model and you have to do something
we
brand
need
new.
radically to change the business model. As I indicated, the report indicated the structural changes in the entire society, including the business model. Because this business model is part of the system that has been created, and then we need those radical systems. And then the business are involved in 4 main areas. They have a prominent impact on the energy, the land. When I said the land is related to agriculture sector, the industrial sector, and then the cities, including the transport sector. Because there is those 4 fundamental areas, there is a need of structural changes on them. Transformation. And then we all know also that transformation is inherently a slow process. And then it cannot be overnight. We cannot radically change, transform the entire economy, the entire system. And then the transition is a slow process. In the energy system, in the transport system, in the land system, in the way also we conceive and manage the cities. All are very important, and all are areas where different business sectors are involved in, and then they are key players.
Now, are you finding them responsive, accepting of that cry to completely change their business models?
The problem is not whether or not they accept the changes. The problem is that collectively, the entire society need to take the problem seriously. And I mean, you know, in the few years back, there were a divide of approaching the climate issues, north and south. And then this is no longer a reality. And then we need, even the poor country, some radical changes. Because when we said that in the industrialized economy, you need a transition, in the poor country, we need a jump starting in the energy system. But all those require the fundamental transformation of the institution we have, on the economic model we are operating, and the business sector, the way also they are operating. And then we know those fundamental transformation if we want to reach 1.5, and it's still possible. According to the report that has been released by the IPCC, it's still possible. But it will require enduring and unprecedented effort.
So let's talk about that. So the efforts that we're seeing, you say it's going to require an unprecedented effort. The efforts that we're seeing, the progress that we're seeing, what's driving that? The companies that are doing the right thing, is it because they believe they must? Is it because they're required to? What's pushing the action that we see currently?
Maybe the way I look at it, there is the current and stick approach. There's clearly legislation driving a lot of the change in behavior by companies, and I think we don't need to look far away from the car company industry, right? They have very strict targets they need to meet, and they've done a lot. They took a lot of steps trying to get there, and then you have a development where that also becomes a carrot, because somebody looks at that and says, "Oh, but this is a business opportunity. I can make money out of this change." And then you have companies coming into play to try and grab that business opportunity. They're not driven by legislation. They're not driven by stick. They're driven by the opportunity. And that, in some ways, I think is driving industry. The question, I suppose, we all have to answer is whether that transformation is going to be fast enough and it's going to bring the results we require to meet these challenges. And I think exactly what the previous speaker said, some of that is not easy, because if you look at any company, the car industry as a good example again, if you want to transform from being internal combustion engine car company to a Tesla-like electric vehicle, what do you do with the masses and masses of factories you have, infrastructure you have? You can't just shut it down from one day to the next and then convert everything into electric cars. It's easy for Tesla to get there in one step, or maybe a country in Africa that doesn't have the infrastructure. But if you have that infrastructure, that basically drags you back and slows down the process. But that's when I think the disruptors in the industry play quite a big role, because in some ways they accelerate that. If you left the industry in their own devices, it's got to be a much more gradual approach, because for them, they've got to do it. They invest in new technology, the new factories they build, there might be electric cars, but then that transformation becomes slow. But if you have a disruptor that is actually eating your lunch, coming into your market and grabbing this opportunity, then you have to accelerate that process, because you have another incentive. It's no longer about taking your time to transform, because you might find that you're out of business before you get there.
Ulf, I was wondering, what's your take on that? How important is it that countries really have comprehensive climate laws and regulations, or if not laws themselves, then at least some clear pledges and actions to give businesses some certainty on which to plan?
Of course, that's of critical importance. Otherwise, we will never succeed. Just before responding fully to your question, let's recap a bit what Juba said here, because the challenge is just massive. We have to decarbonize our economies, our societies. We have to do this within a fairly short time period, and we are faced with at least 3 big challenges. First is we have to mitigate the risk. We have to deal with the kind of cost of getting out of it. We have to manage the adaptation costs, because we see climate changes happening already. We have to invest in new infrastructure, etc., to cope with that. And then we have to develop some kind of measures to deal with all the indirect costs following from migration, from loss of biodiversity, etc. So, of course, this is a task for every one of us. It's for you, it's for pop stars, it's for technicians, for scientists, for businesses, for everyone.
Right. Even though we're focusing on business today, we realize everyone is responsible for solving this. We're all part of the problem and part of the solution.
And then I think that we have to think that business can do part of the story, but governments have to do other things. They have to make sure that they stick to some kind of key priorities, ensure that they have a plan for the transition that's clear, because the transition risk itself is a massive risk factor, probably as big as kind of the outcome of the transition. So we have to keep in mind that, and I think governments will play a very important role in managing that transition risk and reducing it. So governments have a lot of things to do in regulating, in setting standards, spelling out expectations, etc.
Can I just hop in there? Just because I always find it interesting, because perhaps maybe because I'm a journalist and I go out and speak to the CEOs, the politicians, the scientists, the investors, the regular Joe on the street, and everybody has the same thing. Someone else has to do their job for me to be able to do mine, or I'll do it if that person does it.
Someone has to lead, and then everyone else will follow.
And here's the question: why do we have to have a leader? Why can we not all sit around a table and actually have a strong discussion about making money for our clients, making sure we're listening to the experts in the room who've been screaming about this for decades? Maybe we need to also understand that businesses have boards and other investors that they have to account to, that politicians are going to be held accountable if everything else fails. So sit around a table and figure out a solution instead of passing the buck. And I always notice this passing the buck, whether it's civil society or business or government, keeps happening. So we never end up coming up with a solution. We always talk about the transition risks. And it's only coming down to transition risks. But if you take a look at a whole bunch of companies that we did, and we've been doing this for about 4 years in Fortune, it's a list that we call Change the World list. And we looked at companies above $1 billion who can actually make a change when it comes to sustainability. So the companies we found that were really successful at addressing climate change as part of a sustainable business strategy was an umbrella methodology. Like you said, Yuba, it is about looking at society, looking at aging, looking at AI and machine learning, looking at all of the crises that we're going to face, including climate change, and then saying, what's our business strategy? Because we want to survive as a business and keep making money, make our investors happy, make every single person, every customer happy as well. And there are successful examples. Inditex is a great example. Lego is a great example. We've got Walmart that is trying to do a big change, which is a big deal for them. And that list is impressive that there are businesses who are thinking the big picture. The question is, you can't blame one party or have one person leading it. That is the bottom line.
So how are we sure when they take these actions that it's real? Yuba, you wanted to chime in?
I think that there is a limited reading of for me, one of the fundamental messages of IPCC 1.5 report. This is a profound change of the entire society. That cannot be incremental. And then the point is that the climate change is happening in the context of raising an inequality, of the large amount of unemployment, with limited growth, with many other aspects, and then that's related to the entire economic system in which we are operating.
Right. So you're talking about the huge cost.
We cannot say that we need, to make money. Maybe we need to have more welfare for well-being of the entire humanity, people of the humanity, and to reduce the inequalities. And there is a completely different paradigm in that context. Because by only focusing on growth, by only focusing on making more profit, I don't think that we are missing the point, what is there. And then we do have a limited time frame in order to bring those structural fundamental changes in the society.
By the way, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, making money and doing the right thing for the society. I actually think the smart companies are doing exactly that. They're taking a long-term view and looking at what in the longer term is going to be the successful strategy. And this is the short-term versus long-term, because I think we all play a role in how we judging returns. If we, every quarter, put pressure on the companies to do the best they can do over the next quarter, then clearly they're going to be incentivized to look at short-term returns. But the smarter companies would look out many years and say, okay, what actually is going to ensure the success of my company? And they realize that they need to do exactly the right thing because that's what's going to make them successful. And maybe we'll come back to sustainable investing later on. But in our experience, you can invest sustainably and get exactly the same returns as you invest in any other index with same volatility. So the two, in my mind, is not exclusive. But again, one thing I'm sure will come out is education, because I think one of the things that would help facilitate that change is the more people understand the challenges we face, the more they change their behavior. If the consumer is not buying the goods of a company that is not socially friendly, environmentally friendly, then you know what? These companies would change very quickly because they know they've got to go out of business. But that education, I think, I have to say, we shouldn't always look at the negative thing of the negative angle. What encourages me a lot is the younger generation, the millennials. When we survey these people, they're a lot more aware than anybody else about the risks the society is facing. And these people would buy the right product from the right company, and more importantly, they would only work for a company where the value of the company is aligned with their own interests. So if you're a company and you try to compete for talent, you can only be successful with this new generation if you have the right values. So I do think there's a lot of interesting things happening at the front end, because usually when we look at these challenges, we're looking at production, we're looking at the stick, we're looking at the back end. But at the end of the day, the front end is changing quite a lot, and it's changing quickly.
So you're saying that companies today really can't afford to be dinosaurs anymore. I think it's fascinating. In the U.S. just last month, 13 major international energy and chemical companies put together something they call the CEO Climate Dialogue, and they're lobbying President Trump and Congress for climate legislation. Now, though, is that real? Or is that them just trying to forestall tougher measures that they know eventually will come? Are they trying to just control the conversation?
I'm going to ask Ulf to answer that first.
I don't know that specific, what kind of motivation is. But I think in general, business, on the one hand, they're not that much concerned about regulations as such, as long as there's predictability around these things. So there's a general willingness to have, okay, if we know where we're heading, let's go in that direction. So variation or lack of regulation or uncertainties about it is often more costly than the specific regulation. Now, but returning a bit to your point about sustainable investment, I think that there's a paradox or a difficult kind of balance to find between short-term profit and long-term decision. And in politics, often short-termism trumps long-termism, right? I'm throwing back to you as an investor in the banks. So how can you make sure that the data for sustainable investment or financial carbon disclosure monitored on a quarterly basis or a daily basis in the financial markets actually take care of the long-term concerns?
That's a very good question. And I tell you, back in 2017, we published a WEF white paper looking at what business needs to do to address all the challenges in sustainability. And it's obviously a consensus that everybody needs to pull its weight and move that way. But then, we pledged, for example, that we raise 5 billion in impact investing by 2020. And then we wanted to, we want to encourage investors to invest sustainably, but you need to have the products available. And then we started doing the work. We said, let's create a fully sustainable portfolio. And then we realized, for starters, definitions were not there, or the definitions were not really up to standard. The benchmarks, how do you measure performance? The benchmarks were not there. And these things we cannot do alone. And then we tried to engage some of our peers in the industry and say, let's get together and define some of these things. And then data availability and comparability of data is a big issue. Products, like if you want to have sustainable bonds in a portfolio, they were not enough. So we engaged with the World Bank to try and get them to issue bonds, which then we can include in a portfolio, which then we can offer to the clients. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And we all, going back to your point, everybody needs to contribute to that. But I think data comparability is an issue.
Yeah. Because that report came out in 2017. Have things gotten better?
I think there's been a lot of progress, for sure. Again, going back to how do you define global standards? Because it's okay for the Norwegian government, for example, to say, we want to do this, go this way for the oil industries, we stop exploration or whatever. If all the other countries are not following suit, so what you're doing is you're disadvantaging your own industry. So absolutely, you need regulation, but not only that, that regulation needs to be global, right? And that's why things like Paris Accord is so important. Otherwise, what you're doing, you're moving industry from one country to another, right? So you're not necessarily solving the problem, you just move it down the road in another country where the standards are not as high. So you need that umbrella.
So you're laying out some of the impediments. That was what I wanted to ask everyone about next. So there's a lack of data, a lack of clarity, a lack of uniformity across countries, across the EU. What are some of the other impediments getting in the way of business?
I want to actually pick up on what Tema said, because there is an effort across the board to get some of that clarity. There is an effort that's being made. You've got, in the morning, if anyone was in that main room, I mentioned the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFDs. Now, what they found was that people were very picky about the data that they were sharing. They asked 500 companies, 366, if I'm right. I might be slightly off about the number, reported the data in over the last 2 years. What they're finding is that banks, financial institutions, were the first ones to talk about their risks and exposure to climate change and be quite open about it. Again, it comes down to the regulators already making banks being, to be a lot more clear about their disclosures. So that really helped in the kind of numbers that they were giving to the TCFD. What they found was oil and gas companies were the ones who didn't report as much of a risk to their balance sheets from climate change, strangely enough. And that makes you question what exactly is going on here, because if you are saying so much of the economy is at risk from climate change, and oil and gas companies
So no, we're fine.
we're fine, we're not doing too badly, we're okay, we're not that worried, but the banks who are lending to them are, the banks who are investing in them are, or in other companies within the supply chain, it makes you start wondering about that data flow. Why are they not looking at those data? What is the data that they're submitting? So this morning I saw a tweet out from the TCFD actually. It says 91%, this is the latest out of them, 91% of surveyed participants within the TCFD are now claiming or saying they will fully or partially implement the directives of the TCFD, but because the number is so low still of the actual companies, so you have what, 366 companies reporting in, of which most of them may or may not, and we're talking about the world. That's not a lot of companies. So where are the rest of them?
And when 90-something percent have the intention, but they're not taking the action.
90-something out of 366, again, take those numbers into context. It's not a lot of companies that are putting the data in, so he's absolutely right. We need companies to be pushed into giving that data. We need companies to have the exact same criteria, say, that banks have to have. Why are we not doing that? Why are we so afraid of having that data out there saying you're accountable?
And who's got to do it?
Who's
Because I
got to
think
do it?
that's the other
Who's the regulator?
challenge, right? Because you need to have an overreaching authority or somebody that is not just one country, right? Because you need to have a uniform standards across all countries. But again, going back to what I said earlier on, it's obviously that's the one way to regulate. The other way is to put pressure from the consumer, the investor, from everybody else. Because then suddenly, if you get penalized because you're not doing the right thing, but the investors, guess what? You have share prices going nowhere. Then you start having problems raising capital. And then where do you go from there, right? So you're not going to grow, and ultimately you die, right? So is the awareness and people playing a role in it? If people are not buying your product because you perceived not to do the right thing, or you don't have enough disclosure, then it's another way to put pressure. But this is a challenge, and I think, again, the problem is where things are happening very slowly, but we're definitely seeing progress in some cases, a number of authorities getting together, the financial industry getting together to try and establish some standards and try and guide the industry. Like, if you got to invest in, if you got to be classified as a green bond, what is the requirement? Otherwise, you get the greenwashing. So these standards are slowly established, but it's taking time.
We're seeing some questions already coming in on Slido, and they've jumped ahead to a few questions I was going to ask you eventually. But let's go to the first one there. We touched on this earlier, but maybe you all can share some more names. What about companies that are affecting the most the climate change? It says, do you see any leadership actions from them in this matter? And I touched earlier again on that question about oil and gas and chemical companies in the U.S.
Yeah, I can say maybe a few. So first of all, coal companies have been running into difficulties. So, right. So the share price has been dropping, and they are really having real difficulty. I can say a few words about Norway, because as you know, Norway is probably the third or second biggest gas exporter in the world, and the top 10, I think, oil exporter in the world, Norwegian companies. And this, I think, is a huge, let's say, reputational risk for Norway and for some of these companies in the long run. So what is happening? First, I think that in order to attract capital, they need to change. So they are in the business of converting themselves from being an oil and gas company into some kind of energy company. That means that they are investing a lot in renewable energy, amongst other things. And it's not just kind of greenwashing, it's quite significant. So that the investments. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that in order to attract capital, they need to do some kind of, you have to argue that, okay, what will deal with stranded assets? What's the risk of stranded assets, etc.? So that will probably, or has already, changed the way they think about future exploration and the rate of discounting kind of investments, etc.
What about the next
and the third element is on recruiting talent. Because, you know, if you want to attract young, talented people, you want to attract people who are motivated and are kind of conscientious about their environment and other things. And basically, you cannot act badly in order to recruit a young talent.
The next question here on the global carbon tax. Was that something that in the IPCC's report, did you talk about that, carbon pricing as being something that could be helpful?
It's part of the instrument that could be helpful in the whole process, but it cannot be taken in isolation with a number of things. Because as you indicated in the case of the business sector, you have to have a standard. And then the carbon pricing will work only if it's at global level. But you cannot apply the same carbon pricing from Slovakia and from Mali, where I'm coming from. Because you need to have a kind of system that will allow, in the case of Mali, to be use the same pricing than in Slovakia or in the US. One cannot only take one instrument as a solution. It's a combination. It's part of. And then without putting a price on carbon, it's very difficult to redirect investment, as the report clearly indicated, from the fossil fuel energy sector to low or zero carbon energy systems. It will be very difficult and then to redirect investment and then from the building sector toward the cement, the cement industry to a more product that is low to zero carbon housing systems. And then this is part of the solution. It is not the only solution.
Maitri, you mentioned something earlier about civil society, and we were chatting about that a bit this morning. Yeah. How important is civil society's role in this, in talking to industry and trying to pressure them and coming up with solutions together and then taking those solutions to government so that they can act? So, is that happening?
I think pressure is the wrong word. I think we assume it needs to be pressure. I think civil society is critical. I mean, they are the representatives of everyday people. And we always seem to somehow talk about business as being separate from civil society. People are people. They either work in business or they are working in a non-profit sector or they're working elsewhere and probably having far more fun than everyone else. But at some point, you have to kind of understand that the mindset change that you're talking about, Yuba, is required even amongst civil society, because there's a perception that I don't need to talk to business because business will not listen to me because business wants to make money. I will talk to government because they can pressure business. Why does it need to be that way? Why can't we have a dialogue sitting down and saying, this is what I'd like to achieve. Tell me what you want to achieve. Let me look at your perspective. Let me look at the world through your lens. You look at the world through my lens. We'll find a middle ground. I think at some point when that middle ground is found in that conversation, you can then turn around to government and say, we both agree, you're trying to cater to us. You're trying to win our vote. Let's be honest about that. If we're in agreement about this, you should not feel any discomfort in putting the regulation that we need in place. Right now, the conversation seems to be so bifurcated and so siloed that we think we're talking to the right people. We're just not. We're just not talking. Again, I'll come back to that. We need to be talking to each other and understanding each other's perspective. That's the only way that global regulation is going to happen, because in Mali, what doesn't work, it's suddenly, you'll find people in Mali are going to decide, you know what, we're just going to leapfrog ahead because we're just not going to go through what you went through because we've learned lessons watching you. You're seeing this in China, you're seeing this in India. People who are living through climate change are saying, hang on a minute, I'm going to take sustainability in a completely different direction, and my companies are driving this by talking to people.
Ulf, thoughts?
I think that we have to look into the distributional consequences. I'm sorry to say that I don't think Mali will be the kind of chain driver. They will be a victim, and it's the rich developed countries that have polluted the most, and it might very well be that the reaction would be the opposite of what you say. Is that they said, okay, it's not, we have not caused this, so we don't care, we pollute. Because I think this brings us to the fundamental problem. We have to de-link somehow economic growth to carbon emission. And this is, so we have been fairly good at kind of reducing this kind of carbon intensity in order to gain 1% growth, but we're still there that we haven't really sorted out a growing economy, but a reduced carbon footprint. We have to do that. And I think we have to do it in the richer countries.
But the problem is not only the rich country, because there is more opportunity of jump-starting on sustainability of course poor country. They have more advantage. Unfortunately, the institutions, the economic model, and then the financial system will not allow them to do it. In Bamako, I cannot bike. Here, I can bike. Because I'm in the early stage of building my infrastructure. The energy system, the transport system, the housing system, and then even the agricultural system. And I'm in early stage, and I can learn from the mistake and then leapfrogging. But the institution and the financial system will not allow me to leapfrog. It's a mobility system. I can have I can start with the electricity sector and then to have a zero-emission electricity system in the country. It's not possible. The financial, you cannot possible. Most of the countries in Africa, some of them are looking at the coal because it's easy to build a coal plant. They are looking at oil because the return of investment is higher than on the renewables. And then this is the reality. And then some are also building the cement factory. This is one of the most polluting systems. And then you have a tropical environment with 40 degrees on average in the year. And then that means we need air conditioning. It is not because we do not have the technical solution. We do have technical solution. It's the institutions and then the financial system. It is not money. Even the money exists. It's the system through which we are operating will not allow to do to leapfrog. And then we will face the same problem we face with the ozone. We decided to get rid of CFC refrigerator. And then the same year, we dumped them in Africa, from Europe to Africa. And then you will have soon the electric transport system, electric cars. And then all the diesel car and other car, we get in Abidjan. And then the reduction we get here, there will be leakage. And then in many African countries, they will not be like the Chinese government and then to stop to clean the air. They have no possibility to do it. So that what we'll gain here, you live massively in the other part. And then this the problem is that we have to look at the entire system in the entirety and then to solve the problem rather than
kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. Pushing it elsewhere.
How do we stop that?
I mean, there's a lot of points there, right? And going back to some ways to look at everything globally, because if you look at one country, then you have migration of that pollution, so you don't solve the problem. But if it's a global approach, then it's easier. But then it's the byproduct of that. You cannot penalize developing countries for the same standards as developed countries because they already reach. So, okay, I'm sitting here, I'm looking okay. But the other element, the other opportunity, I think, where especially the financial industry can play a role, is how can we help direct financing to these countries to be able to meet those goals. And one of the things we found is growing very fast is impact investing. So in the past, you had philanthropy, so people gave money away for a good cause, that was that. And then you had ESG, and then you had sustainable investing. But all of that is just very broad. A lot of the investors today, they want to have a much more focused approach of their investment. And also, going back to customization, a lot of our clients, some of them are care a lot about the environment. Some of them care a lot about society. They care about something else. So rather than just give them something for everybody, you can actually say, okay, what are you interested in? Climate change, right? So let's direct that investment in climate change, but not just anything. And you go to a company and say, okay, what are you trying to achieve? I want to improve efficiency of houses in Africa by 20% in the next whatever years. Okay, so we'll give you the money, but we measure you against your target. So if you achieve your targets, then we give you that loan interest-free or whatever, or then we have to charge you 5%, whatever.
So
then it
that's
becomes
a
a
way
lot
of
more
holding
targeted.
people accountable then.
Yeah, exactly, because then it, I
real
think,
results.
is more likely to get the desired result rather than just broadly spread that investment.
So this is a different, this is a really more targeted than way you're saying the old sustainable investing, ESG investing is not enough then today.
It's just evolving. It's evolving to new areas. And I think we started a long time ago from philanthropy and then exclusion principle. We don't invest in any oil companies or tobacco companies or whatever. And they became more, okay, you can't just exclude a sector altogether because oil companies will not disappear. They will still be around. So it's more encouraging the oil companies to do the right thing. So which of the oil companies are actually having the biggest progress in reducing their carbon print? Let's invest in those companies to encourage them to do the right thing, right? So that's sustainable investing. And then impact investing is the latest trend where investors are much more demanding and saying, that's what I care about, that's what I want, and I want to measure that impact, not just give the money away and wash my hands, because I want to see there is a result out of what I'm trying to do.
So is this a wonderful way then for investors to even increasingly push action on climate change directly themselves?
They're doing it.
But more than ever before, it sounds like, if it can be this targeted.
I think we both would agree, and all of us would agree, it's happening not just from consumers who are getting more aware, investors are getting more aware. We've got 320 odd signatories on a 33.5 trillion assets under management who are going around telling companies, what you're doing is not cool. We're not going to let you get away with this. This is not how we want to spend our money. And that's where money talks. There's no board out there that's going to be saying, wait a minute, we're going to tick off the folks who, pay for our wonderful private jets. We're going to do what they tell us to do. Otherwise, we're all going to be out of our jobs. Our golden parachutes are going to disappear. So even if they don't feel like they agree with the investors, but if the investor is telling them, you better do this, otherwise we're pulling the plug, they're going to make that change. So at some point, it is about investors pushing for it. And do the investors need to get more vocal? Do they need to get stronger, more globally together, set those regulations? Sure, that can only help, in my opinion. It cannot hurt.
But going back to
go ahead.
Sorry, just to going back to the point about the investors will also. Going back to the younger generation, the biggest change we see, the younger generation, they care a lot, the women, clients care a lot. And these people, again...
Private offices.
Family offices. They want to align their principles to the way they invest, right? So that trend can only become stronger. And I suspect if we sit here in 5 years' time, we won't be even talking about ESG investing because it will be a way of doing business. If you don't do ESG investing, you just will be out of business as an investor. So things, I think, will progress. But the question is how much more the investors will play a role in exactly pulling the plug from the CEO, the board, getting a lot more involved in that discussion. But I think that is evolving, is happening, and it would only become more significant.
I want to ask you a question, if I can, and you as well. When you deal with female leadership, whether it's in the financial sector or in corporates or folks that you meet, are they more passionate? You too. Are they more passionate? Do they listen more than some of the male leaders? Because I found that with the female CEOs I meet or the female leadership in boards that I meet, that they are more empathetic. They are more aligned with the younger women. But is that what you all see across the world?
We do. We definitely see more engagement. And again, not just from the companies, but going back to our clients as well. When we surveyed clients, investors, how much they care about sustainable investing, I think the average was about something 82%. The response amongst female clients was 88%, significantly higher. From millennials, 86%. So it's a lot more engaged. They care a lot more. They're a lot more passionate.
Why is that?
Because we need to change behavior, and then the women are, and then they are much more amenable, and then to educate. And then education, behavior change will take years, will take time. You have to start when you are a kid. And then they are the one all the time with the kids and others. Because along with the technological solutions, the radical solution, that is the long term, we have to change our behavior.
So are men more rigid and inflexible in their thinking?
Yeah, but they are less than the women. And
Let's
they
take a
can
poll
change
around
the culture in the company and the institutions.
I think we should be careful about making too strong gender issues. But I've seen some studies basically saying that young men are more motivated for salaries, whereas women of the same population tend to be more motivated working for companies doing the right thing. Right? So it could be that there's a bit of difference there.
Women are more virtuous?
Yeah, I don't know. So as I said, I
was talking more along the lines of the fact that female leadership seems to be quite willing to take the risks necessary for the transition risks that you were talking about. That it seems to be that in their heads they know this is the direction they need to go in, and they're not afraid to go in that direction, no matter what the consequence. And numerous leaders that I can name who have taken quite a hit politically or within their boards, but they've stood up for it, if they believe it. But then again, I'm just wondering if that's
But you talk to a lot of CEOs. Is that what you're experiencing in top management?
They are. I mean, to me, the CEOs I'm speaking to they're one of two people. They're either Prince Charles in a conversation with Mr. Trump. One is a believer and passionate, a visionary. The other person is not 100% sure, but potentially can change their mind if their business needs it, because they definitely don't want to lose money or shut down. Hedging is what we talked about. Some are hedging, some truly believe.
Let's go now to our audience in the room. We've been getting a lot of great questions from Slido, but I know we have fabulous minds here. So we have a question here in the front. If you would identify yourself, though we may know who you are.
Hi, I'm Nick Gowing. I was there at the beginning.
You
can see my question right up at the top there. And you come to the point where I was trying to get to about 20 minutes ago about human behavior. And it's been fascinating listening. We had a long conversation in the car about this yesterday, part of this. But it's about the human behavior. And I'd like to put on the agenda, based on all our work on thinking the unthinkable. It's actually the top executives and decision makers are stuck in a mindset. And the main problem, which we've got data, enormous amounts of data on privately from those who speak to us confidentially, is the conformity which qualifies them for the top, disqualifies them now from understanding and appreciating the enormity of what has to be done. And it picks up on your point about particularly men and salaries and so on, about the conformity. And therefore, all the discussion so far has really been about institutions and companies, as opposed to the human beings who now have to take that decision. And many of them are looking for a way out. They want to be convinced, they want to be reassured, as opposed to worrying about their pensions, their stock, and everything else. It's a very visceral human issue, and that's what's not on the agenda at the moment.
Well, I think it's interesting. That kind of goes to the question, the bottom question there. Business responds to demand. So how do we effectively change, back to what you said, behavior, but the behavior of the consumers? Thoughts?
Education. Going back to where we started. the more educated the people, the more demanding they will be. But again, there's, I think, been a lot of progress in that respect. But I think education plays a big role, because then if people understand the long-term impact of their choices, I suspect the decision will be a lot easier.
Plastic bags.
I think that is not it's education, information, and awareness raising in a continuous basis. Not when there is something happening in Mozambique, and then it will be the headline of the televisions on the newspaper. 2 days later, nothing. It has to be on a continuous basis. Look at how we get rid of cigarettes. 30 years ago, if we were in this room, there will be a lot of hash row here. People were smoking. We found it normal. Today is abnormal. Even any places, public places, to smoke. And then how we have been able to do that. And then we need is education, information, and awareness raising in a most continuous basis. And then we do have means to do that by the different media we have. But unfortunately, the headlines also are on catastrophes, not to educate people.
I think single-use plastic bags are the best example, right? How many of us go to the grocery store now and buy a single-use plastic bag? We carry our bags, and it's really good for business because they don't have to shell out money for that. We bring our own bags.
Right.
It works.
Exactly.
It
I
works
remember that.
for
Yeah, I used to always get the plastic bags, and now I have a stack that I carry into the grocery store with me, and that's normal. And it's odd to see someone getting plastic.
Comes back to education.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to a question here in the audience.
I'm Daniel Shadlovsky from Peru. I'd like to continue from this gentleman's comment. There's a question of risk aversion. Now, I've been the chief financial regulator, and my terms of reference were to be awfully cautious, awfully cautious. Now, so regulator is cautious. That may be a central bank or maybe financial regulator is very cautious. That means you move slowly, because you don't know what the future is. Where you are right now is better than the risk. Okay. Now,
Isn't there a greater risk of doing nothing?
Pardon?
Isn't there a greater risk in doing nothing? If they're risk averse?
For to begin with, the climate change is a long term away. You know, you're in office for 5 years if you're lucky, and that's going to be 20 years. But your mandate is keep things safe. And you know what's safe now. You're not sure what the risks are. So yes, if you're very inventive, you know, there's a variety about regulators. But this also happens among corporate boards. You know, you're the head of a GM or somebody, and you're gonna take a risk at massively moving your production to electric cars. You've got to be a little bit crazy, like the fellow who does Tesla, to take that kind of risks. You know, it depends on a very, very special mindset. And the argument here was that if you get to where to get to these jobs, you are pre-selected to be risk averse. I can tell you from experience amongst my co-regulators, I was extremely on the tail end of being willing to take risks. People get extremely, extremely risk averse.
Do you have a question for the panel, or would you all just like to comment on his thoughts?
I actually want to say something to that, because I think you are right. Boards are very cautious. Most people are. And that's what I'm seeing changing amongst CEOs, regulators, central bankers, God forbid. You're seeing change agents within that field as well. You're seeing the rise of the CEO activists, people who are willing to be optimistic, people who are willing to take risks, stand up to their boards, stand up to investors who may not like the returns they're getting or the risks that they're taking, and put their entire careers, their pension, their golden parachute, whatever you want, on the line for what they believe in is going to be right for the company down the line. And that movement has happened within the top echelon as well. It's not just young kids going out and marching. There is a whole segment of that leadership that's changing, and that gives everyone some heart that it'll trickle down. It will trickle down at some point.
But what I also find interesting is the conflict between regulators as well, right? You have one country, you have the one regulator saying you can't take risk, another regulator says, well, you actually need to change your business plan completely because we worry about this and that and that. So the business is sat in the middle and try to deal with these conflicting demands coming from exactly the opposite side, right? So the one says, don't take risk. The other one says, well, you have to throw everything up in the air
so
and
they
change
do
your
nothing.
model, right? Well, they try to weave through all this regulation. What can I do without making my one regulator very upset, well, I'm trying to meet the demands of the other regulator and trying to sort of, and I think, again, going back to the business would always look also, where is my strategy, where I want to go to in 5 years, 10 years time, and also where is the business opportunity. And that's why I think going back to the consumer, going back to what's happening, disruptors in the industry, because you need to look at all of that and boil it, take it down to your strategy to formulate your path going forward. But it's not easy for companies.
No, we have a question right here. Or Ulf, you want to say something?
No, take that question.
Okay, go right ahead.
Okay, my name is Bobo Lowe. I'm an independent analyst. I wondered whether the issue of risk aversion is actually less serious now as the problem of climate change has become much more immediate. So it's no longer a question of this is a problem that the planet will be, planet's temperature will be up by 3 degrees by 2050 or something like that. It's actually, you feel it here and now. And the example I would use is public attitudes forcing change in Chinese government policy. For example, air quality in Beijing is infinitely better today than it was 5 years ago. And yet this is a Leninist party state, highly authoritarian, yet still responsive to public pressures because they recognized that the party's long-term legitimacy relies on a certain amount of public approval, even though it's an authoritarian state. And I wonder whether this would also be the case for climate change more broadly. Risk aversion, in other words, has become, if you like, too risky because the problem is so much more immediate.
Yeah. Take that one.
So on this risk, and I think there are 2 or 3 things happening, and some of them are good news. So first is there's less uncertainty about the scientific foundation about climate change happening. Basically, there's a consensus that these things are happening. Secondly, and this relates to what Bobolo said, there's no uncertainty about the time perspective either. It's we know that this is happening now. And I would also say that, there is quite uncertainty about what would be the winning future technology. Because there's massive investment in research and innovation, and nobody really knows what kind of technology is in, let's say, for cars or for storage, etc., that will ultimately win. So that, I think, is uncertainty. And then I think during the last few years, it's quite interesting how central banks have reformulated the risk. Instead of saying, like you initially said, basically saying that, okay, here's some uncertainty, let's stick to what we have, to basically flipping it 180 degrees. Say, hey, climate risk represent a huge financial risk. And it's a systemic risk. And as a central bank, we have to take climate change into account in order to assess financial stability. And that's our core task. So these central banks, groups of central banks, have basically formulated climate change as a core function of central banking. And I say it's a massive change. Right.
Wait, well, you don't have a mic.
Oh.
I'm sorry. Briefly, here we go. Now we can hear you.
This change of central bank attitudes led by the governor of the Bank of England, and it's not the Netherlands Bank, and now it's in the Bank of France, and another 16 or 18 central banks. That's an absolute sea change. Yeah. One cannot underestimate the importance of that. When central banks say boo, everybody else says boo. So, this gets the whole financial system aligned. It takes a little time, but this is absolute sea change. I think now we have a chance of really moving this forward. Because that lever, when the central banks get moving, things begin to happen. And across, finance pervades everything. So when the financial authorities start moving, and this kind gentleman can tell us because he sees it every day, this is a massive change. I think you're absolutely on target. Now I think we're going to see some difference. I'm glad to see what you're talking about, about the boards. But again, that's all reinforcing in the same direction.
I would like to see Mario Draghi go boo.
Say again?
I would love to see Mario Draghi go boo. That'll be fun.
We are nearing the end, and I want to just ask you all to just kind of a very lightning round. Give me your thoughts. I was so moved by the young Swedish teenager who in Davos said, you know, I don't want you to be optimistic. She doesn't have time for that. Just, I want you to panic. The house is on fire. So how do we panic but move forward quickly to a solution if the house is burning down around us? Briefly, just your final thoughts.
I still going back to making people aware of the urgency of the problem and just making sure that people understand how urgent and how much needs to change to get there. And I think we all got a role to play in that: industry, individuals, governments.
I'll go for my usual 4 favorite statement. First, we need a strong leadership, a system leadership with a vision. Second, we need institutions that translate, that take the vision in a concrete action. And then third, we need resources, not only human financial resources, new type of institutions. And then the fourth one is to bring together short-term and long-term. If we look at only on the long-term or the short-term, we never are able to bring the two together.
Thank you. Oh.
I agree on that. And if we can, in addition, add the social norms of a low-carbon lifestyle, and to what Nick said also, if we can help to empower leaders or citizens to make choices that are kind of moving us in the right direction, that would be great.
In my 3, you get the last word.
Oh, thank you. Build trust, leave some of your cynicism at the door, and believe that there is a mindset change happening in places you wouldn't expect.
Everyone, please join me in thanking this fabulous panel. Really wonderful. Thank you all. And also, if you would join me now in welcoming the host of the next panel. It is Annabelle Chapman. She is a journalist from Warsaw, Poland. So she'll be leading the upcoming discussion. We're going to have to change the set here, the stage, just a moment. So Annabelle, welcome.
Hello, Kathleen.
So what did you think? Did you get to hear a bit of our session?
Fantastic, yes. I'm looking forward to discussing these things in further detail now from the EU perspective with the Minister.
I'm going to hand off the, there we go, the Slido questions, etc. to you. So should be an interesting discussion then that you have.
Yeah, what do you think the main takeaways for Europe would be then based on your panel?
Well, I think my 4 panelists said it so well, you know, the need for consensus, the need for action. And again, as the young Swedish teenager said, you know, act as if the house is on fire. We aren't running out of time. I think we almost are out of time.
Well, it sounds as if European leaders are getting their act together here with their recent decisions in Sibiu, Romania.
And we had such terrific questions on Slido. I have been using Slido at a variety of events. I moderate a good bit around the country and the world and in the US as well. And we don't always get the vast number of questions that we got here today. I think it was a lot of fun. I think Slido is such a lovely tool because you can bring in people who aren't in the room, you know, who may be watching, who may be watching online, and make them a part of the discussion, you know, and then you come to the room, the immediacy, the great questions that we got from our fabulous audience.
Well, thank you so much.
All right, lovely.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Annabelle.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome our guest, Minister George Chamber, Romania's Minister Delegate for European Affairs.
Thank you. So,
hello, Minister.
Nice to see you. So, thank you.
So we're meeting here today during Romania's EU presidency, which began in January. Minister, I would like to ask you, what is the single most important theme of the Romanian presidency, in your opinion?
You know, the theme we proposed from the very beginning, which was cohesion. You know, in a way, we were being a country that joined later, we knew the value of cohesion for the Union. In the same time, because of all the disruption that was around at the time that we took over the helm of the Union, this was as well something that would bring the a message of unity, you know, because cohesion actually has a different meanings, and you can speak about economic cohesion that basically is convergence. We can speak about social cohesion that basically means non-discrimination, but we speak as well about political cohesion, and political cohesion is unity. And I think this is what Europe needed most and needs most. And especially that we had a presidency that was, you know, at the end of an institutional cycle, which had the challenge to draft a new strategic agenda and to be able to put forward with all the member states a new strategic agenda. In the same time, we are facing, you know, the uncertainty of Brexit that we are still facing, and many other things that I think we'll speak later on.
We will discuss all of these things in good time, but I wanted to ask, first of all, when you were planning the presidency, what was some of the challenges that you encountered, perhaps domestically and also in Brussels?
Basically, I think, it was very clear that we are going to be a presidency that would have to deal, as I mentioned, because Britain left, Britain was supposed to leave, they gave up the presidency. So instead of the second half of the year, we got the first half. And the first half was, challenge and opportunity. The challenge was that we had to deal with so many unknown factors, and I mentioned Brexit, but there are others. I think we are working on the MFF, we are working on in the way we are going to shape the next budget of the Union, but there was as well a lot of opportunity. The opportunity was that we could be really finding going back to the mission of what should be an efficient presidency, and an efficient presidency, and the president that represents all is the presidency that is an honest broker. And this is a presidency that delivers for everybody. Delivers not only, doesn't have a hidden agenda in terms of, favoring the North or the South, the East or the West, or, the countries that would like a tougher stance on migration, the countries that have a more liberal stance on migration, So I think we had this opportunity. And I could say at the end that we have done pretty well, because I think we are not going only to speak about the future of Europe. We can say the Romanian presidency shaped the future of Europe, because all these pieces of legislations that were enacted are going to they are going to change, and they're going to have an effect on the daily life of the European citizen.
So just to ask, because Romania joined the European Union in 2007, it's one of the newer member states. When did the preparation for this presidency begin, really, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
I think the presidency began, actually the presidency preparations began 2-3 years before. I think I remember, the first time we really gave a thought about was when I was Secretary of State for European Affairs back in 2014, 2015. So this was the first time we started preparing ourselves for. But preparation at that time were for something that was not supposed to be the same, because as I mentioned, we were supposed to be in the second half, and and nobody thought Brexit is going to be part of our agenda. So nobody at the time we started had the full agenda that we really had to face, and the challenges that we were facing in these 5 months, soon to be 6 months of the year. So we were planning. It would have been a completely different planning if it was the second half. I think we had to focus a lot in the first months, and we delivered on working with the European Parliament in order to deliver legislation, and we delivered a number of pieces of legislation. Just to mention the Natural Gas Directive, that is such a strategic piece of legislation that I think could, just in itself could be a symbol of the Romanian legacy to the Union. Then we have done many things on the social side. We should not forget that we established the European Labour Authority and a number of other directives that are going to deal with working conditions, social conditions. We as well enacted what is the digital copyright legislation. That is an important piece. It's the first time we are trying to have a regulation that applies applies to the digital market in a way, you know, encompasses obligations in terms of copyright rights.
So these are some of the more specific things that you've achieved during the presidency. I'd like to ask also a bit about the bigger vision. So let's talk about the Sibiu Summit, which was held on Europe Day on the 9th of May this year. And as I understand, it was postponed because of the uncertainty over Brexit.
No, it wasn't postponed, actually. We chose from the very beginning, the 9th of May. I should say the Brexit was postponed because of the summit in Sibiu, which actually this is the reality, if I look today. So, frankly, you know, Sibiu was an important moment in not only for the presidency but for Europe, because, you know, I think before Sibiu, and at the beginning of the year, there was a temptation to have a very gloomy picture of the Union and how Europe would be looking after elections. I can see that, you know, the Sibiu was a bright spot, and it was followed by European elections that, you know, impressed all of us with the turnout. I think overall in Europe the turnout increased, and there were many of the member states that were skeptical that this is going to happen. This is a good sign, because that shows that you know, European citizens care about Europe and care about European elections. These were more important elections than used to be European elections.
So in Romania, actually, the turnout increased quite a lot.
In Romania, it increased 50% from 32 to 49. And
why do you think that was?
I think, you know, it was first of all because, you know, everybody knew that it has to show that Europe is important. I think, you know, in a way, by Sibiu, this was the first step, and by the European elections, we have been slowly able to get out of the trauma of the Brexit. Because, you know, Brexit, I think, was a trauma for each member state, and especially for countries like mine or here, you know, they joined later and wanted so much to join the Union. It was so difficult to understand why somebody would like to leave the Union. And so I really, you know, in Sibiu, I think the bright spot was there was a sign of unity. You know, there was, I could not say that, you know, the declaration is sorted out, you know, these 10 commandments, so to say, sorted out the world what had such a bigger vision. But what I have to say is that just the fact that we had such a good summit and the leaders would not use it for any political purposes, which was quite a great temptation if you organize a summit so close to the European elections, was, I think, a matter of great importance to be highlighted.
So you mentioned that at the summit there was a Sibiu declaration that was adopted with these 10 commitments, and I'd like to ask you about some of them. So one of them refers to the EU leaders are saying, we will show each other solidarity in times of need and we will always stand together. What does solidarity mean in Europe today?
This is something that I think came out, we saw later on when it came to the elections, because, you know, we saw that the turnout increased almost in each member state. I think, you know, solidarity, I think the results of the European elections is that these 10 commitments that we have undertaken in Sibiu could result in a more ambitious strategic agenda for the Union. Because at the end of the day, you have to make a correlation between the 10 commitments and the Sibiu spirit, because, you know, we're speaking about the Sibiu spirit in a way that made the bridge with the, you know, the Élysée spirit and then the Aachen spirit. So we had this idea that when it came to Sibiu, it's not only about things that you can show, you know, it's not only about, you know, the 10 commitments or what comes out in written form. It's very important the atmosphere. It's very important how the leaders get one with the other, how the leaders engage the citizens.
So this is the spirit of Sibiu.
This is the spirit of Sibiu, which is a spirit of unity, and it's a spirit of more solidarity. I should not say full solidarity, but I think it was very clear there was a lot more solidarity, because, as I mentioned before, nobody was using the pretext for trying to get some more votes.
But solidarity can mean a lot of things. It can also mean financial solidarity. So how do you think that's going to play into the budget talks, for example?
No, this is something that we still have to see how it's going to play. What I can say is that because of the results of the elections, I think we should have a higher level of ambition for the strategic agenda. And in the same time, I think we should have a high level of ambition for the budget, because some of the cliches that were mentioned did not fly, did not work. So, I can say that one of the things that got out of the European elections is that, we didn't get such a polarized Europe that to need, to fight too much. So I think it's very important to preserve the momentum from the European elections, and how we could do better than to adopt a more strategic and ambitious strategic agenda, and in the same time to be able to complete sooner the discussion on the budget. So Romanian presidency is going to present its own, its own version, its own draft of the nego box, soon to be in the General Affairs Council, I think. And this, I think, is going to be the legacy we are leaving to the next presidency, who already have been able to deliver on a number of sectoral programs, some of them of great importance, and because we are speaking just about numbers. We tend to speak about the budget only about numbers, but we don't speak about the toolbox. We don't speak about the new tools we brought in.
I'd like to return to the European elections just a bit more, because you said that the turnout increased, but how would you interpret the result? Was it promising for you?
I think the results, show a strong majority behind the European project. And I think this is an important outcome. As I said, we don't have only to look on the results, we have to look as well in the campaign. I can say that, and I have to come back to the idea what is, the effects of the Brexit in things that you say and on the things that you do not say. For example, nobody was more speaking about leaving the Union. Whatever angle we had, was speaking about better union, of course, from different angles, but it was not speaking about, I would like my country to leave the union. We didn't have anymore as well the discussion for the first time, I think, in the last years after the sovereign debt crisis about leaving the Eurozone. So I think these are important things, and I think we have to as well to take stock on. Now we see on the numbers, I think, of course, we have to have the usual European method. That means that we have to see how these numbers are going to align behind the institutional setup and the institutional appointments. But, as we are all aware, once you have the numbers, you are going to be able to create a majority that is going to be very pro-European.
But it's a different configuration, isn't it? Because there are more liberal...
It's a different one, but not in the sense that, it's a different one if you speak from a political family point of view. If we speak from the European project, I don't see so much minus plus. Of course, there are still issues that we have to be sorted out, because actually we don't know the configuration, because, once Brexit is going to kick in, the numbers will change, and the percentages will change. So what you see now, that you need a larger majority, you need the bigger number of political families getting together, and you need less, because if you factor in, and this is exercise that I think would be interesting to be made by to see how would be the EP now and how is going to be the EP when Brexit and if Brexit takes place.
So would you say that apart from among European leaders in Sibiu, there has been a change in the spirit among ordinary Europeans?
No, I think that it didn't feed in any frustration that could have a negative effect. I think this is the most important thing. And in Sibiu, as well, they were able to engage from different angles, but everybody had at the center the European citizen. So, it did not matter so much the ideology. Everybody was speaking about the European citizen. So I think this was as well a plus. Plus, I think Sibiu was a good moment because, we didn't made it something that could have crushed, in a debate. We didn't want to have a talk show in Sibiu. I think it was a good thing that all the leaders that went there were very clear that they will have to be there in order to show unity. And we preserved some of in Sibiu. I think this was a place that we could preserve what we got out of the negotiations for the Brexit. This is one of the reasons that I think we were mentioning as a presidency that is a plus of the Brexit, because Brexit actually it's something that should not have happened, and in the same time for us is a sort of lose-lose. You cannot speak that something good gets out of it, but the best you could get out was the feeling of unity.
So is there because you say it's a lose-lose situation, Brexit, but is there something good that could come out of it? For example, for Romania in itself?
For us, I don't think it's something so good that could come out of it, of course, but what was good is that the 27 were able to stay together. And, this is a difficult exercise to negotiate one member getting out, and, we had the siren song for some of the member states maybe, singing, and nobody had any kind of temptation to follow it.
But do you expect the EU to continue sort of business as usual, or do you think that there's going to be some different changes, member states who want to perhaps change the direction a little bit? I know that in Poland, where I'm normally based, there's talk of reforming the European Union. There are also some people who wanted to be more responsible on climate. What are your thoughts?
No, I think in Sibiu we were able to put together many of these themes. Clearly, you need to reform. I don't think that you need any kind of abrupt change, and I don't think that you can have any abrupt change. We keep on speaking from the sovereign debt crisis time about that we cannot do treaty change because this would be so difficult. But I think we can do a lot of changes in the method. But there are as well some practical things that came out of the Brexit. We are able to have this piece of legislation, that forbids political parties, or fines and punishes political parties if they are going to use personal data that was collected for commercial purposes, which was exactly the inspiration of it, and this was the first time it was used in this kind of regulation in the European elections. The inspiration of it was what happened in Britain during the referendum, because we cannot separate the Brexit as well with the campaign, the campaign before about the referendum, and about the fake news, and about all these things that went wrong and should have been forbidden, but they were not, and were able to influence the results.
So I'd like to ask you a question from the audience, maybe from the room or from our internet users. For now, from Slido, which you can see on the screen here. But please feel free to submit more questions via the app. To what level the 2050 long-term strategy will be a priority for the remaining time of the presidency? Do you see any progress on the subject?
No, right now I don't think that we have a 2050 long-term strategy. I think that what we are looking on is the strategic agenda 2019-2024. And I think this is a priority for the remaining time of the presidency, because it has to be adopted by the European Council in June. So I think this is one of the priorities. And of course, another priority that we are looking for is enlargement.
So I'd like to, just before we move on to questions fairly soon, I'd like to ask you about how important European values are in all of this, in this change of spirit in Europe. What are the values that you're representing as the presidency?
No, as I mentioned, the main value, I think it was cohesion, because cohesion means solidarity, means unity, and means as well standing together against discrimination, it's being having a space which is governed by the same values, and being a space that is governed by, by the same approach towards any kind of countries, not to make any discriminations. So I think cohesion was a way to describe what Europe needs more. And of course, when we discuss about the budget and we discuss about so many subjects, sometimes we start to forget about one of the main missions of the Union, that is, convergence. You know, and I think this is what we wanted to revive. I think Romania wanted to revive the value of convergence because, you know, we are a sort of child of convergence because, you know, when we joined, I think the GDP of Romania today, if you compare a couple of years ago, actually, 10 years after we joined, the GDP of Romania doubled. So, you know, and I think this was a proof that Europe works not only in terms of, you know, of abstract themes, but it works as well of bringing prosperity. And this is what is convergence about.
So I wanted to ask you, those are maybe the internal values, but how do these values play out in Europe's policy towards the world? Because here in the Sibiu Declaration, there's talk of Europe being a responsible global leader. What does that mean for you?
You know, for us was the very beginning mean, first of all, to be a responsible regional leader. A responsible regional leader means that it has to deal more, you know, with issues like enlargement. You know, so for us, I think enlargement is one of the main themes. Then when we move to the global arena, we have to recognize that for many years we neglected areas like Africa. We neglected trying to have a more horizontal approach to foreign policy. So we just thinking that, you know, Europe, we have to live to the high representative, and there is not going to be any kind of other things that we have to do there. And we found out that this part of the world, other superpowers were a lot more efficient in competing, and not only competing, but bringing not the values that we'd like to see there. Because, you know, what is about Europe, it's about soft power, exporting values, but in the same time, having so to say, an action that as well not only speaks but as well does things. And I think we have some new things now in as a toolbox, and the next commission would and the next cycle would benefit from what we agreed on. I think when it comes to Africa, what Europe can do more in terms of using not a model of international aid, but a model that puts the emphasis in creating value in the economy, more on an investment type of approach than just giving help. You know, not to give any more as many grants as before, but to be more on the loan side.
Moving on from that, I mean, one of the challenges that affects everybody, whether in Africa or in Europe, is climate. And I've got a question here from the audience about whether climate change, which was the topic of the previous panel, is a priority for the Romanian presidency at all. What have you been doing in that direction?
You know, in terms of the climate change, I think Romania has, for example, you know, I think it still has a lot more to do. First of all, it has to do more because, you know, as we are aware, all the countries that were in the communist part of Europe were inflicted damage to the environment because of the forced industrialization. And you know very well, you know, in a way, the issues of Romania are not so far from what you see in Poland because of what happened in the past and what kind of, you know, pollution we had at that time, and what kind of waste management we should introduce. On the other side, when we speak about climate change, I think Romania's, for example, mix of energy, it's one of the most less polluting that you could find, because, you know, even if it's not considered to be climate neutral, for example, things like what Romania has, like nuclear energy, do not pollute. You know, they don't have a carbon footprint.
So someone has followed up on what you were saying about enlargement, and they're asking, do you see Ukraine and Moldova as joining the EU in the future?
I think that what I can see, what we invested for so long, and this is something that we have to take into consideration, countries like mine and countries and many other countries, is about the Eastern Partnership. So I think it's very important that Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, they keep on the European path. You know, we engaged them. I think they have a unique status, which we have to recognize that already they have a unique status towards the Union, which is the CFTAs and the associations agreements. This is something that nobody else has, rather than, you know, the candidate countries. And I think this is the starting point for doing more. Of course, it's going to depend as well on their own merits, and it's going to depend as well on what they are going to be able to deliver at reforms. And but for countries like us, all the time, it's important that we speak not only about reforms, we speak as well about the strategic dimension of the Union.
So, I mean, we've got a few minutes left now, and I'd like to take some questions from the audience in a second. Before we move on to that, could you please just sum up for us the main successes of the Romanian presidency? And in response to this question I have here, what have you learned?
Let me know. So we, as I said, there was many pieces of legislation. I mentioned some. I would like to mention others too. Like the expanding with 10,000 people the Coast Guard. We know this is a regulation that Romania was able to adopt that responds to the mission of defending the external border. There will be a lot of other things that we have done, because we speak about 90 pieces that we enacted of legislation, which is quite a record for any presidency, I think. Even for presidencies that are in between institutional cycles, I think this is quite an achievement. I think the main lessons learned is that we have the administrative capacity to deliver. I think what was the learning curve for Romania was that, in a way, after getting into NATO, after getting into the Union, holding with success a presidency is a sort of, end of transition cycle. So, so it's the way you feel really a full member. Once you chair the council, you are going really to feel that even if after you are not anymore, you are going to feel that you are equal to all at the table.
Thank you very much, Minister. We have time for a quick question here from the gentleman who's been waiting.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute. I completely agree the psychological impact of seeing Romania chairing the Council, and I congratulate you for your work. But just to remind you, because you mentioned cohesion, the Donald Tusk's speech delivered in Romania at the beginning of your presidency was very much sort of warning you about certain things on which the Commission had differences with Romania. There are still differences with Hungary, there are still differences with Poland. I don't want you to get involved in the differences, but I want you to say, are you worried about these differences? Do you think these are temporary things that are going to be managed for the real cohesion to be achieved?
No, if you ask about Romania, they were temporary. If we speak about Romania, I think we can say they are temporary. There is not any more doubt about our commitment on observing the common values, the rule of law, and all the other common values that we speak about. When it comes to the results of the presidency, I think this is as well one of the things that we have to mention. That even if we had a tough type of politics in Romania, and there was a tough type of politics as well in terms of perceptions abroad, this did not influence at all the presidency. Romania was not shelving files because it was in the interest of Romania, or I don't know whom in Romania. So we really acted with a honest broker. And this has to be recognized because, this is what is supposed to be the presidency. And I'm not so sure it has been so much in the past presidencies. So, we were able to put on the table whatever we found, and we were able to find compromises and qualified majorities, even to things that maybe are not going to be in the great.
Thank you very much, Minister. This is all we have time for today. Thank you for this interesting discussion on the future of the European Union and Romania's part in it. Everybody, please stay here because we have the next GLOBSEC talk coming up on the future of war. Is it still a human affair? Chaired by Dominika Kunertova and Scott Cullinan.